Welcome back. This is Dan Gardner, and in this module, we're going to be dealing with demand management and in-house manufacturing models. Essentially, U.S. manufacturers that import raw materials, sub-assemblies, components, etc., go into production and then out into a distribution environment. In terms of the objectives for this module, we have three. First, we want to understand the relationship between the demand management function and a U.S.-based in-house manufacturing model, a company in the United States that manufactures but is importing raw materials. That relationship between demand management, essentially, is working off of a sales forecast and converting that sales forecast into purchase orders on vendors overseas, of course receiving those purchase orders, the raw materials associated with those purchase orders, and putting them into production. Second, we're going to look at demand management within the framework of what is referred to as manufacturing, planning, and control, MP&C. All of the functional activities coming together, forecasting, materials planning, purchasing, production, etc., to execute on a production plan. Third, and probably most obvious for this module, we want to identify the links between in-house manufacturing and the importation of raw materials. Agenda, very consistent with our objectives. We'll start out with an analysis of in-house versus outsourced manufacturing, that whole make or buy conversation. We'll get into some key definitions. We will definitely get into detail around what manufacturing planning and control is. We'll focus on manufacturing planning and control for an in-house manufacturing model, and then wrap things up with import considerations for that in-house US-based manufacturer that is importing all of these raw materials. Let's get down to work. Here's that slide once again that we've seen so many times and will continue to work with, but now within the context of looking at the differences between in-house and outsourced production. Do we manufacture ourselves in the United States, or do we outsource production? This entire module focuses on the in-house strategy for production. In the next module, we will definitely look at outsourced production, but in this one, it's all about in-house. And as we see in the center of this slide, we're going to be working on the importation of raw materials, components, sub-assemblies, definitely work in process, wrapping up production and putting out finished goods, but also dealing with accessories, service parts, etc. As we've said a number of times, demand management is on the customer side, the sell side of the supply chain, and receiving and interpreting demand signals, starting with a forecast and then actual demand signals in the form of orders from customers, and converting them into purchase orders on overseas suppliers, which is the focus of this module, importing those raw materials, getting them into production as the manufacturer. In this case, that's going to be us, and then back out for distribution, completing the circle, essentially. Let's move on and look at a little bit of the history behind the trend towards outsourced production. As most people know, since the 1980s, the U.S. has been on an ever-increasing trend towards outsourced manufacturing, having someone else produce our goods for us, sometimes referred to as contract manufacturing. There are some subtle differences between contract manufacturing and outsourced manufacturing, more semantics than anything. But over time, contract manufacturing has been more related towards the outsourcing of production for technology products, consumer electronics, smartphones, tablets, things of this nature. For our purposes, outsourced manufacturing, contract manufacturing, while recognizing some of those semantical differences, pretty much the same thing. Over time, second bullet point, the big attraction has been access to very cheap labor overseas, lower prices basically. So we've seen the outsourcing of manufacturing to be especially predominant in industries with high labor content of a semi-skilled nature. And most definitely the United States, and other countries too, Europe for sure, as a continent, not just a country, has taken advantage of low labor rates in Asia, starting with China. With that said, our third bullet point, decisions on in-house versus outsourced manufacturing, are among the most important a company will make. Sometimes we hear the terminology make or buy. Should we do something ourselves or should we outsource it? And that is essentially the big decision that any company has to make, especially new companies that come onto the scene, and definitely in the internet age. Do companies engage in manufacturing or do they outsource manufacturing and focus on their core competencies of product design, sales and marketing, etc.? In this module, we'll say it one more time, we're looking at in-house manufacturing. In the next module, outsourced production. As you'll note from the title of this slide, now we're going to look at arguments in favor of in-house production, doing things, making things ourselves, albeit with imported raw materials. First, there are natural ties between the demand and supply side of the supply chain. There's no breakage, there's no divide between what goes on in the sell side of the supply chain and the buy side of the supply chain. Hopefully, we as the manufacturer, we as the importer, can exercise greater control over the entire process. There aren't as many third parties to deal with, certainly not a contract manufacturer or an outsourced manufacturer. Second bullet, enhanced quality control. We are the ones making the merchandise, so we can control the quality of the goods. There are lots and lots of great manufacturers overseas, third-party manufacturers, but the ability to directly control quality, it's just not the same. The point being, if we're making the goods ourselves, we have direct control. Third bullet, and continuing to speak about control, we as the manufacturer have greater control over specific supply chain functions. Starting with demand management, that forecasting piece. Continuing on with the receipt of actual demand signals from customers in the form of purchases or sales orders. Converting those demand signals into purchase orders. Moving into dealing with raw material suppliers ourselves. Direct control, direct contact with raw material suppliers in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, wherever they happen to be. Just greater control functionally. And as we've said a couple of times now, and this is related to the linking of the buy side with the sell side of the supply chain, there are clear links between demand management, procurement, purchasing, and manufacturing. Because what are we procuring? Raw materials going into our own manufacturing environment based on the forecast and the demand signals that we work with directly. Continuing on with some arguments in favor of in-house production. This is an important one. Complete discretion over prioritization of production runs. We, as the manufacturer, get to decide what is made first. Conversely, in an outsourced model, we pretty much have to get in line with the overseas producer because they are the ones coming up with the master production schedule. They are deciding what gets made first. Now, they're going to prioritize by time and by customer. That's all very true. But we don't have as much control over that. With our own production, we have complete discretion over how to prioritize those production runs. Another really important one is direct contact with those raw material suppliers and subcontractors that we're importing from. We're placing our purchase orders for raw materials directly on those vendors. We have relationships directly with those vendors. We negotiate prices directly with those suppliers. Direct contact, in spite of all the valid arguments for outsourcing, there's a lot to be said for that direct contact. And hopefully, last bullet point, depends on the organization, the U.S. manufacturer, but use of a single enterprise resource planning system, ERP, a term you may have heard quite frequently in the marketplace. As we see in a moment, and wrap up with the last slide in this section, ERP systems are integrated software packages. Let's talk a little bit more about that right now. A quick supply chain perspective, just to level set our understanding of what ERP is, Enterprise Resource Planning Software. We're going to hear that term a lot. We want to make sure everybody understands what it is. Over the years, the term Enterprise Resource Planning, ERP, has become very popular. As such, it is important to define exactly what ERP is, what it does, as well as how it has evolved during the internet age especially. In general, second paragraph, ERP software, it's a suite of functionally oriented modules that are integrated across an organization. Another one of those fancy sentences that requires some elaboration. So we're talking about software, but software that carries out specific functions. The forecasting function, materials planning function, production planning, human resources, payroll, a number of functional areas that do not stand alone. They are integrated and communicate with one another. That is the key point about ERP. Sometimes we hear terminology like a standalone system. That is a software package that carries out a specific function. Warehouse management system, as an example. We're talking about a functionally oriented suite of software capabilities that are integrated. They communicate with one another. Some examples: accounting, forecasting. We mentioned human resources, definitely manufacturing and purchasing. The key differentiator of ERP systems, and we've said this, is that each functional area is linked to the others, and updates across the organization, they are automatic. So if something changes in one module, that information is going to cascade across the other functional areas and update automatically. Perfect example. If a sales forecast changes, it goes up, it goes down. That means we are going to have to make changes in other areas. In a production environment, alterations to our material requirements planning function, and certainly production. When the forecast changes, the numbers change, the module for ERP, in our example, automatically updates. Tells us what changes we have to make and the quantities of raw materials we need to acquire. With the advent of the internet, ERP vendors, the companies that sell and provide ERP services, have augmented their deployment capabilities to include both on-premise ERP, meaning the software is installed on the customer's servers, the customer's computers, as well as what has become more predominant, cloud-based capabilities, which are accessed via the web. The clear trend has been towards cloud-based capabilities. That wraps up our first section. When we come back, we'll talk about arguments against in-house production. Please return soon.